By the 1930s, the United States government had spent decades intervening in the affairs of Latin American nations, particularly in the Central American and Caribbean areas of the region. Adhering to the Roosevelt corollary, presidential administrations had deployed soldiers in Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba, and other nations during the period to ensure they remained aligned with U.S. policies and open to U.S. economic investment. As a result, there was a great deal of anti-American sentiment in Latin American nations from those who viewed the United States as too meddlesome and exploitative. After his election in 1932, President Franklin Roosevelt was determined to improve the relationship between the United States and America's southern neighbors. Roosevelt's new outlook was embodied in a segment of his March 1933 inaugural address. In his speech, he stated that the United States would conduct diplomacy in Latin America through cooperation rather than intervention. The U.S., FDR said, would become a good neighbor to other countries in the region. In the years to come, the Roosevelt administration took measures to improve America's image in Latin America. Through programs under the Good Neighbor policy, the United States government hoped to accomplish three tasks. First, the Roosevelt administration wanted to reduce the anger that had been building within Latin America over the decades of U.S. intervention in the region. Second, the U.S. wanted to maintain strong economic ties with Latin America. By the end of the 1920s, American industries had invested over $5.5 billion in the region and wanted to ensure their investments continued to pay off. Third, as events leading to World War II unfolded and Axis powers spread propaganda in Latin America, the Good Neighbor program stressed the idea of shared hemispheric defense and unity against Germany, Italy, and Japan. The government would accomplish its objectives by using propaganda that stressed the similarities between the United States and Latin America and highlight the culture of the nations south of the U.S. The goal was to erase some of the preconceived stereotypes that Latin Americans had about the United States and also those that people in the U.S. had about Latin America. Through these efforts, FDR hoped to build a Western Hemisphere that was economically, militarily, and diplomatically united, although ensuring that the U.S. led the way. Much of the Good Neighbor policy involved attempts at cultural diplomacy. Unlike traditional diplomacy, which involves government officials of one nation promoting the policies of their country to officials in other nations, cultural diplomacy is a nation's effort to promote its arts, entertainment, scientific and technical achievements to the people of another nation. The Roosevelt administration created the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, or the OCIAA, in August 1940 to carry out the Good Neighbor policy. FDR tapped the well-known millionaire and philanthropist Nelson Rockefeller to head the new office. Much of Rockefeller's corporate and philanthropic work focused on Latin American nations, so the administration believed he would be the ideal person to lead America's effort to change its image in the region. The OCIAA's mission was to build strong commercial and cultural ties with Latin America and ensure growing hemispheric solidarity in the face of increasing Axis presence through economic and psychological warfare efforts. The cooperation between the U.S. government and Walt Disney that took place just before the U.S. entered World War II in December 1941 offers a good example of cultural diplomacy and the Good Neighbor policy. In the summer of 1941, government officials proposed that Disney lead a goodwill tour of artists and animators through South America. Disney cartoons were quite popular in the region, and the Roosevelt administration hoped that Disney and his staff would be well received as American cultural ambassadors. During their tour, Disney artists collected material for a series of cartoons designed to appeal to both U.S. and Latin American audiences, promoting hemispheric friendship. The goal of these films was to make North and South Americans feel comfortable with each other by accentuating cultural similarities and portraying the U.S. as a partner working with various Latin American nations. While geared towards U.S. audiences, these films were well received in Latin America upon their release, appealing in certain ways to the national pride of the nations depicted. As the German government made inroads in the region after the mid-1930s, the OCIAA was also responsible for ensuring hemispheric solidarity in the face of increasing Axis presence through economic and psychological warfare efforts. The OCIAA's goal was to sell the American way of life by promoting U.S. liberalism and democracy in Latin America, making these ideals attractive to Latin American nations. The OCIAA planned to disseminate its message through press, entertainment, and propaganda. Its informational mission included sharing positive information about the U.S. through U.S. channels and local assistance, counteracting Axis propaganda, and promoting Latin American republics favorably within the U.S. OCIAA messaging typically revolved around four main points. First, Latin Americans needed to understand that their best interests were linked to the U.S., which would lead to a better life for all. Second, Latin American interests were harmed by the Axis powers, with the OCIAA emphasizing German and Japanese plans for world domination and publishing details of atrocities committed by Germany in Europe. Third, the organization promoted the message that the U.S. would ultimately win the war due to its military, economic, and moral strength. In the fourth message, the OCIAA emphasized that Latin Americans should make personal sacrifices and help to produce goods for the war effort. The Good Neighbor policy laid the groundwork for all Latin American countries to follow the U.S. when it entered the war against Japan and Germany. Nations whose governments depended on U.S. support to stay in power, such as Cuba and other Caribbean and Central American nations, were among the quickest to join. Mexico aided the war effort through aircraft patrols off the North American coastline. Brazil became the greatest Latin American ally, permitting the U.S. to build air and naval bases in the country, which were strategically important due to Brazil's geographic proximity to Europe and Africa. World War II also helped tie the nations more tightly together economically as the U.S. required Latin American raw materials for its war effort. The end of the Second World War also saw a change in U.S. policy in Latin America. In the years to come, the Good Neighbor policy would fall by the wayside as the U.S. became more concerned with ensuring that communism remained out of the Western Hemisphere and that Latin American nations remained allied to the United States against the Soviet Union during the Cold War.